Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're at. Thanks for joining us today. This is Dan Harlacher, Senior Product Manager here at On1 Software. I'm joined by Liz LePage, who's helping out on questions today. Today's webinar is the Perfect Photo Suite Under the Hood series. This is actually the third in the series, and I apologize, there was about a 2-week absence since the last of this series. We were in New York for Photo Plus, and then I was really sick last week, so I wasn't able to do it last week. I thank Johnny for covering that webinar for you. So if this is your first time you've been to one of our Under the Hood series, this is kind of directly from the development department. We're looking at the development process of the Perfect Photo Suite. Right now, we're right there on the orange line. We're only a couple of weeks from the finish line. There'll actually be one more beta release or one more pre-release that you guys will be able to try out. That'll be coming out next week, and that one will be feature complete. All the features and all the buttons and graphics and everything will be in there. So we can't wait for you guys to get that in your hands and get started. Now, I'm going to answer a couple quick questions here before we get started. If this is your first time viewing a webinar with us, you'll want to ask your questions through the questions module. So on your GoToWebinar control panel towards the bottom, there's a little section called questions. You can type your questions in there, and then Liz will go ahead and answer those, or she'll break in and we'll ask those questions verbally. Now keep in mind there's hundreds of people on the webinar, so it's not very practical to ask questions over the microphone instead. So you'll just need to type your questions in. If the audio tends to break up or I sound like I'm underwater more than usual, you can either try switching over to the telephone option, or you can log out and log back into the webinar. Keep in mind all the webinars are recorded, so you'll always be able to watch these again in the future. You can watch them at the archive webinar section of the On1 website, or by going to our YouTube channel. All right, I think without further ado, let's get started here. Now, I do have one quick question I wanted to ask everybody, and this will just kind of help me tailor today's presentation. So I'm going to launch a poll here on the screen, and if you guys could just answer this question for me, it'll help us make sure we're providing the best information for you today. Usually at these Under the Hood webinars, most people already own Suite 7 or 7.5, but if we have some earlier owners or people who haven't purchased the Photo Suite yet, I want to make sure that I can cover enough detail in those other modules that everybody's getting good information. Well, with about 80% of people voting, it looks like we're pretty strongly owners of the Perfect Photo Suite 7 or 7.5 already, over 87%. So I'm going to focus just on new features today. That doesn't mean that there's lots of other things in the Perfect Photo Suite that are really cool. You'll just want to check out our website to learn more about the modules that we're not going to talk about today. All right, now for those of you who aren't familiar with the Photo Suite, it is a standalone application designed by photographers for photographers that kind of gives you everything you need to make your images look great. Now, it's not just a collection of plugins like Nik or Topaz. It actually is a single unified application that allows you to go from module to module. And we really focus on modules, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But it also works wherever you work. You don't have to use it as a standalone application. You can also use it through Lightroom or Aperture or Adobe Photoshop, Photoshop Elements, you name it, all sorts of different places that you can access it, or you can use it as a standalone. So it really kind of gives you the best of both worlds. I find myself using it more and more as a standalone the more that I use it, even though I've got a long history with Photoshop and Lightroom. Now, the suite is actually we take a modular approach. We actually break it down into 8 modules that tackle 8 different workflow areas. The beauty of this is you only see the tools on screen that you need for what you're working on at that moment in time. Now, new in Perfect Photo Suite 8 are the new Browse and Enhance modules, and then there's been quite a few changes in Perfect Effects. Now, I'm going to focus today's discussions really around some of the newest features inside of Perfect Effects. If you want to learn more about these other modules, there's tons of other recorded webinars and lots of information on our website that you can watch. But today, I'm going to focus on just a few examples of some of the new tools inside of Perfect Effects. We use Perfect Layers a little bit too. All right. Liz, any questions I should answer before I get started here?
No, I think you're good.
All right, great. All right, so I'm actually going to use the Browse module in the suite today to keep track of my files. Now, if you use Lightroom or Aperture or Bridge or iPhoto, it doesn't matter. You can keep track of your images however you want to. I'm starting to use the Browse module more and more. I like the Browse because it's super fast. I don't have to wait for a catalog to go find my thumbnails. I don't have to add everything to my catalog. I can just browse logical folders on my disk. So I've already created a folder of all the images that I want to work on today, so it's easy for me to find and work on them. The first one we're going to work on is this architectural shot of these stairs, and this is in Rome. I think it's in the Vatican. If I did a good job of keywording, I'd know exactly where it was. I'm sure some of our astute viewers will recognize the staircase and be able to tell us exactly where it's at. I'm going to start by removing all of these people from the shot. So I'm going to send it first to perfect layers. So when you're inside of the browser, or if you're inside of Lightroom or Aperture, you would just right-click on it and say Edit in Perfect Layers. You could also click it right up here in the module selector as well. And when it does that, we get the option of controlling whether we open the original file. In this case, this is a JPEG file. If it was a RAW file, this option would be disabled. We can also edit a copy, or we can add it as a layer. And if we have an already open Photoshop file, we can add it as another layer inside of that file. That's handy if you're replacing backgrounds or swapping heads or things like that. I'm going to select the edit a copy option. That way my original file is safe and untouched. And I can pick the format that I want to work in. I want to work in Photoshop. And this original file was shot in sRGB, so I'm just going to leave it in sRGB. So this will make a copy as a PSD, opens it up in perfect layers, and now we can get started. The reason I tend to like to send things through perfect layers first is I'm kind of an old Photoshop guy, so I'd like to keep a layered workflow. That's why I selected a Photoshop file, so that each step in my workflow will create a new file inside, or a new layer rather, inside of this Photoshop file, which lets me go back in time if I want to. So the first thing I do whenever I open a file is I make a copy of the layer that I'm working on. So I'm going to click right here on this first icon right here, duplicate a layer, and that makes a copy. That means at the bottom of my layer stack, I've always got the original pixels. I can always go back to them. It's also really handy to compare what I've done, and if I want to mask my results in, if I decide my results are too strong, I can always blend them back in with the original. All right, so I'm going to take that copy, and I'm going to use some of the new retouching tools inside of the Perfect Photo Suite. The one I'm using a lot these days is the new Perfect Eraser. Perfect Eraser makes it really fast and easy to remove distractions but maintain the information that would have been behind them. So, for example, if I want to start by getting rid of these light bulbs that are hanging down, I just paint right over them, and you can see how it fills that in with realistic image detail. I can do the same thing with these tourists right here. I'm just going to paint those guys out. And you can see how it continued the banister and continued the steps behind them. Looks like I forgot to get rid of their hand there. There we go. Just keep dabbing it if you need to continue retouching. Now, again, because I'm doing this on its own layer, it's easy for me to compare what I've done so far. I'm just going to turn that top layer off so you can see there's before and there's after. All right, let's keep going. I'm going to continue to remove some of these people from the shot that we don't want. Oops, I missed a little piece of them there. There we go. I always feel like I should hum when I'm doing this because it's kind of boring for you guys, but it's a kind of an initial step that I do on just about every image. I want to kind of go through and get rid of some of these distractions. Liz, is there any questions that I can answer while I'm doing a little retouching here?
Oh, because it's so wonderful to just watch you retouch, Dan.
Because
It's
it's so
amazing.
exciting watching me use the Perfect Eraser. So
Oh yeah. There was a couple of questions about the browse module, and I guess if it links back to Lightroom. I think some people are kind of confused that it's a separate application. So maybe you could touch on that really quickly.
sure, I'm just gonna. I actually don't really like these three little yellow stairs. You can tell like some safety guy in Italy decided that they needed to paint these bottom stairs yellow for some reason. So I'm just gonna get rid of all that yellow. It's kind of annoying. I'm fairly sure the original architect didn't intend that. So Sorry, the question on the browser. So the browser is a standalone browser, and when you launch the suite as a standalone application, you'll see that browse tab, and you'll be able to manage and keep track of your files. When you come through Photoshop, you don't see it. You'll just go straight into the module that you select. If you work through Lightroom or Aperture, you can either go straight to a module or you can go right into layers. You don't really see the browser in there as well unless you actually click back to it to find another file that you want to add to the file that you already have open. So hopefully that kind of answered that. Now, I've used so far just the Perfect Eraser, but there's a couple of spots where I didn't do as good a job as I would have liked. So that's a great time to instead use the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool is the third one down. It's actually been in the suite since suite 7.5, but it's been kind of hidden. It's been a feature underneath the retouch brush, and people didn't know it was there. You had to turn out a little checkbox. Now it's its own tool, makes it a little easier to find. Sometimes I like to use the clone stamp tool for a couple of reasons. First, it lets me control the feather and the opacity, so I can blend things in a little bit better. And it also lets me control exactly where I'm cloning from to where I'm cloning to. So I'm going to start, and I want to clone these two good steps right here over these bad areas. So I'm just going to position my brush where I want to start, my source. I'm going to hold down the Option key on my Mac or Alt key on a Windows computer. I'm just going to click right there, and then I'm just going to start to paint, and this will paint over that with the good information, like that. And just take a couple of strokes to kind of clean that up the way I like. There we go. Now this one doesn't have to be perfect because what we're actually going to do is make this look more like a very old antique photo. Let's just toggle that upper layer off so you can see with all the people in it, and then there's after. Let's go ahead, I'm going to take that and we'll send it to Perfect Effects. There we go. I think one thing I did forget to mention, I did mention that there's a new beta 3 coming out, but for some of you guys who don't know how to get a hold of the beta, you just go to our web page and click on Perfect Photo Suite 8, and right there you can sign up to download the beta software as well. And what we're using today is a beta software, so it's not the final version that you guys will have your hands on, so it won't be, this isn't quite as pretty or quite as fast as what the final one will be. All right, so I want to start off in the left in the new filters. You notice how there's a bunch of new filters in Perfect Effects 8, and I want to use the new antique filter. So I'm just going to open up the antique category, and inside of it you'll see presets for the antique filter. Now I can adjust all of these, and a lot of times what I like to do is use the Quick View Browser button. You notice when I mouse over each category, there's this little grid icon. When I click on that, it will show me my image with the presets in that category. You can just use the slider down here in the bottom corner to make those bigger and smaller, and this makes it easier for me to go find the look that I'm looking for. And I want this to look like kind of a very old antique photo. I think I'm going to go with this green one right here. There we go. And if you noticed, it's changed the contents of this filter layer to antique, and below it selected the antique filter, and it's adjusted all of the options to match that antique green Autochrome look. Autochrome is a very early color photographic process. I can control also the brightness of the image, so maybe I want to make it a little darker. I can control the amount of haze. A lot of times old photos didn't have really deep blacks, and as they age over time, they tend to have more of a hazy look to them. We can decrease the saturation. We can control the color in the image. Everything we need to create that very old antique photographic look. I'm just going to turn this layer on and off. So there's the modern color version, and there's that antique photo look. Now, to really finish this antique look, we have to kind of make it look like it has aged and cracked a little bit. So I'm just going to add another layer. So I click on the Add button right here at the bottom of my stack. That puts in a new layer. And now I want to go look for a texture that's going to make it look like it's aged. So we'll come over to our filters. I'll scroll down to the textures, the texturizer category. And I'll use the Quick View Browser button again. I just click on that. And again, it shows me everything up to that point in my stack with the textures applied. I'm just going to scroll through until I find one that really kind of gives it an antique look. This dark concrete actually is pretty cool. It almost looks like some of the emulsion has flipped off. That would be a good choice. Let's keep going and see what else we like. The flare would be a little too modern for Autochrome. The lens, the scratches are kind of cool. Sometimes you just stumble across one that you really like, and I kind of like this tattered paper gray one right here. We'll click on that, and you see how it kind of makes it look like it's on paper, and the paper is cracking, and the emulsion is coming loose. That looks pretty cool. And again, it's added that filter, and we have full control over it. We can control the opacity or the strength of the texture. We can shift its color if we wanted to. We can even make it larger or smaller or rotate it around. In this case, I think I want to flip it around because I don't like this one crack at the top. So I can just click the rotate texture button, and it'll move the texture around my image. So I can position things just where I want them to be. Just like that. I like a little bit more of the cracks at the bottom personally. And I think to finish this, I want to make it look like it was printed on paper. So we'll add a border. We'll go to the borders category. Rather than shopping through the presets, I want to do it manually this time because I know exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go to my borders. I'm going to make sure I pick the antique category. And then in the border types, I can just pick the one that I want. And I want the tin type number 2 option. There we go. And that makes it look like it's got an old antique print border on it. Let's take a look at the before and the after on this. To do that, I can just toggle the before and after, or the preview button down here at the bottom. So if I toggle preview off, you can see before and after. Now you'll notice how the image is actually a little bit smaller. That's because in this border pane, I've used the new fit image slider. That lets me control how big the image is inside of the border. If I had this turned all the way to 0, let's just turn the border off here for a second so you can see this. The image extends all the way to the edge, but when we add a border on top of it, that means we're going to have to cut off part of the image. The image is sitting underneath the border. This new fit image slider lets me shrink the image down a little bit so that I get as much of the image as I can inside of the border. There we go. Another thing you can do for previewing that I like is if you hit the Tab key on your keyboard, this will hide the left-hand presets and it'll hide all the control stuff on the right, so you see just the image by itself. And then you can hit the before and after toggle, or here this little split screen toggle, and it lets you see before on the left and after on the right. Makes it really easy to see what your progress is so far. All right, I'm going to pause here for a second and see if the audience has any questions that I can answer.
Yeah, there was a question. I think you were going kind of fast inside Perfect Effects, and there were a
Okay.
couple people who wanted to know about how you added multiple layers together.
Yes, we can definitely cover that. I'm just going to hit the Tab key here. That will bring those left and right control panes back in. And I'm just going to go back to my single image preview. So right here in the filter stack, think of this like a layer stack in Photoshop if you're familiar with the concept of layers. Or you can almost think of it like a history as well. So if I click down here at the very bottom where it has the name of the image, that's the original. That's where we started. That's with no changes at all. You can then insert what we call a filter layer, and you can do that by clicking the little plus button here at the bottom of the stack. And inside of that filter layer, you can put whatever filter you want. And by putting in multiple layers, you can put in as many filters as you want in any order that you want. If you think about it, almost like filters over the front of your camera. If I was a landscape photographer and I went out to take a picture, I would probably start by maybe putting on a graduated neutral density filter to darken the sky, and then maybe I put on a warming filter to warm the image up, and then maybe I put a polarizer on the outside to enhance the contrast a little bit. This is the same idea, but you're just doing it through the computer instead, and you've got a lot more filters that are a lot more cool than the glass ones you would have put over your camera to work with instead. So if I wanted to put a new filter in here in between these steps, between the antique and the texturizer, I would just click on the plus button. So if I click plus, that inserts a new empty layer. There's nothing in it. I can pick any filter that I want to put in there. Let's go and put in, let's use dynamic contrast for this one. Dynamic contrast will help me just enhance this image a little bit. I'm going to use the texture enhancer preset for that. You notice when I add that all the texture in the banisters really jump out and pop. Now I've inserted that in the middle of my stack. I can now turn everything else back on above it, and it will add the antique back in. So if I click on antique, it adds the antique back in. And if I click on texturizer, it adds the texturizer back in. I click on borders, it puts the borders back in. So it really allows you the flexibility to create any look that you want just by stacking these filters up. And you can then go over here to the preset menu, and you can save this as a preset so you can use it over and over again. So if this is something I like to use, I can save it. So I'm going to call this my Autochrome. And I can pick a category that I want to put it in. Now I've got a lot of categories, so ignore those. I'm just going to create a new one. I'll call it My Presets. You can even give it a information about who created it and what it does. And I'll click on the Create button. And then when I come over to the Presets tab in the browser, if I go to My Presets, there's that new preset that I created right there. And if I had started from scratch, and you can do this too, if you want to reset your stack so that there's nothing in it, so you're starting from scratch, just click on the trash can. That trash can will remove everything that you've done so far. And then when I click on a preset, like my Autochrome that I just created, it will replay everything that we've done up to that point. It'll replay all those things that we had in our stack. All right. Hopefully that answered the questions. Let's take a look at another image. I'm just going to hit cancel, and we'll close out of this image. Let's take a look at another one. I'm going to go back to the browser, and let's do, how are we doing time-wise? Let's do this one. This will be kind of fun. This is a wedding shot in Central Park from our good friends at Fred Marcus Studio in New York. I'm going to click on the Layers button to send it to Perfect Layers. Again, I'm going to edit a copy because this is a JPEG and I want to make sure I keep the original information in there. Open that image up. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to use that handy Perfect Eraser again to get rid of all these annoying people in the scene. So I'm just going to grab the Perfect Eraser. Let's make my brush a little bit bigger, and I just start to paint away the things that I don't want. There we go. Let's get rid of this guy up here. Oops. There we go. And let's get rid of all these people. Let's paint across all of them in one step. And we'll fill those guys in. Just keep painting with the Perfect Eraser to tune up its look a little bit. I'm also going to be blurring this background a bunch, so I'm not going to agonize a lot over how perfect it looks. I'm going to get rid of this little tree in the foreground. There we go. Let's zoom in, and there's a couple little distractions on our bride and groom as well. I'm going to get rid of this little clip that's holding his yarmulke on. There we go. And the little tie. Perfect. All right, now we're ready to send this to Perfect Effects. So I'm just going to click on Effects. I'm sure someone who is astute noticed that I already broke my rule and forgot to make a copy of my background. I'm going to go to Filters, and I'm going to use the new Lens Blur filter. If there's folks out there who loved Focal Point, this is now Focal Point living right inside of Perfect Effects. But the cool thing is you now have the ability to use it with all the other stuff in Effects, including the Perfect Eraser. Oops, I noticed I forgot to retouch the little tails on his tux. Let's go fix that real fast. The wind caught the tail of his tux. I don't really like it. It's kind of distracting. So I'm just going to use that Perfect Eraser to get rid of that as well. There we go. Now let's go to Effects. We'll go to the Lens Blur. I'm going to grab the first one, the Tilt Shift preset, And you notice when I add this, the masking bug appears. The masking bug is going to let me control the area that I want to keep in focus. What I really want to do is I want to keep just the plane of the rock in focus, the rock that they're standing on. I want this in focus. I want the foreground in front of it to go out of focus, and I want the background behind it to go out of focus. And to accomplish that, we're going to have to use the masking bug to protect the rock, and then we'll use the brush to paint the bride and the groom back in. So I'm going to make this very narrow, and I'm going to position it right over the rock, and we're going to adjust the little feather lines there to have a very short feather. So it's going to go from in focus to out of focus very quickly here. There we go, kind of like that. Then we'll grab the brush, and we're going to use the brush to paint them back in. I'm going to start just by painting right on top of them, and this will paint the blur away and brings them back into sharp focus. When I get close to the edges, I'm just going to enable the perfect brush option, and this will sample the color underneath and makes it quick to create an accurate mask along those edges. Again, this is one of those times where I really need a soundtrack. Maybe Liz could do some beatboxing for us.
Dun, 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 dun. That's more the I could do the Jeopardy. That probably wouldn't go over very
The
well.
Jeopardy song, I'm pretty sure we get sued for that. So,
Oh, that's right.
any questions that you can answer while I am brushing?
There were a couple of questions about whether you were going to talk about blending modes and the opacity sliders.
I
There are a
can.
few questions in there about both of those topics. So I wanted to
Now,
make
are
sure
we
you could hit those at some point.
sure? Now, are we curious about those in perfect layers or in perfect effects? Do you know?
I believe it looks like it's in perfect effects, but it's good to note maybe where they are in both
Okay,
programs.
sure. We can definitely talk about that. I will grab a different image and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So, one of the things that's important when you paint out a blur, and this is actually something that's very unique to the lens blur filter. Typically, when you blur, you're using pixels from everything that's adjacent in the image. And that means if I paint away blur along a hard edge like this, I'm going to get a halo along the edge from the pixels that were inside the image. The lens blur filter is very unique in that it only uses pixels from the selection when doing the blur. It's not just a simple mask. So you notice I can paint the blur away along this edge, and it actually doesn't have a halo around it like it would if I used, for example, the blur tools in Photoshop. It's a little smarter than that. So there we go. Cool. That should get us pretty darn close. I'm going to go back to fit to screen here. And while I'm here, I can use the lens blur tool to control the amount of blur. I'm going to bring the amount of blur up a little bit. Let's go up to about 20 or 25. This will blur the background more. And I'm also going to darken the background just a little bit by using the brightness slider. We'll bring that down a little. There we go. So you can see how we've now blurred and darkened the background so that the bride and the groom stand out more. Let's turn the preview on and off. So there's before and there's after. While I'm here, I think I'm going to add one more filter. So I click on the plus button, and I'm going to add a glow to this. I like to add glows a lot of times to wedding shots. So we'll go to the glow category. Let's use the Quick View browser to go find one we like. And the one I'm going to use is called Deep Forest because we're kind of in the forest. So this adds kind of this dark, rich glow to the image. And I can control how strong it is just by using the amount slider right down here in the glow pane. And I'm only going to use that about 30%, just enough to add just a little bit of warmth and a little bit of glow. Let's take a look at the before and the after. There's before, and there's after, just like that. So we got rid of those annoying folks in the background. I'm going to apply this one here, and we can actually compare it back in the Browse module. There's our results. back in layers, I'll save those results and we'll close it. And back in browse now, there's our original image right there. And in just a second here, it'll update and we'll have the copy that we created. There it is. So there's before and there's after, just like that. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our next image. Any questions, Liz?
Yeah, there was a question about the masking bug and where you got it from
Mm-hmm.
and whether there were presets that went along with it or you just click inside. Maybe you could reiterate a little bit more about the masking bug.
Sure. I'll actually show a little bit about the masking bug and the masking brush on our next image here. I'm just going to select this one. This is actually a raw file. This is shot in New York along the skyline. I just select the image. I'm going to send it to layers to start. You notice when I have a raw file, that edit original option is disabled. Now, because this is a raw file, I'm actually going to use a nice big broad color space like ProPhoto RGB, so I have all the color. I'm going to make sure it's 16-bit as well. I always like to do this because people think that we always just use tiny little JPEGs for these demos, but we don't. This is actually a full-sized raw file straight out of I think this is like a 22 megapixel camera. I'm going to click on the dupe button so I have a copy. I'm going to use that eraser to get rid of my little dust bunny over here on my lens, actually on my sensor. There we go. All right, now let's send this off to Perfect Effects. The reason I picked this image and what I wanted to show you guys are the adjustment brushes. The adjustment brush and the adjustable gradient tool are two of the most powerful tools in effects that are new and most people don't really know that they're there. They replace the old basic brushes that were in previous versions. The cool thing about these is they're much more flexible. In the past, when you added a basic brush, let's say you added one called Brush Lighter, all you could do with it was brush things lighter. And if you wanted to, maybe I wanted to make it lighter, but I also wanted to make it warmer, I would then have to add a brush warmer layer on top of it. It would take more layers. I'd have to brush the same area twice. Now, with the adjustable brush and the adjustable gradient, I can control the most common parameters all at the same time, all on the same brush. So to use it, just click on the adjustment brush. This adds an adjustment brush layer, and then at the bottom, you can click what you want it to do. The most common things you'll want to do, there's buttons for at the top, but below that there's those preset pop-up, or you can pick even more options. I want to use the detail option. What that's going to do is it's going to paint in more detail. It's going to reveal more detail. So I just click on that. You notice my image hasn't changed at all. All it's done is it's loaded up the brush, and you notice how my brush is selected. Now I just paint in more detail where I want it. So I'm just going to paint, and you notice as I paint that we're revealing more detail in this concrete under there. Now when I get close to the edge, I'll just turn on that perfect brush option, and now it will automatically mask the edge. What that means is I'm going to turn on an overlay mask so you can see this. It actually automatically stops at edges, and those edges are determined by color. So you can see even though my brush is in the sky, because the sky is a different color, it's not getting that detail added to it. I don't want to add detail to the sky because it'll tend to make the clouds look unrealistic, and it'll bring up any noise that's in the sky. So I just want to add the detail just to the building. And watch, as I just paint along there, it just automatically knows where the edge is, and it's smart enough to stop for me. This perfect brush technology is available in almost any place where you have a brush tool. So inside of Perfect Layers, it's also inside of Perfect Effects like I'm using right now. It's also inside of Perfect Portrait when you're adjusting skin areas, so it can be a very handy tool. Another trick with brushes that a lot of folks who are used to Photoshop probably know about is that you can draw straight lines with a brush by clicking and then shift clicking at your destination, and it'll draw a straight line between those points. I went a little too far there, but that's okay. I did that on purpose so that I can use the perfect brush, and I'll just toggle my mode to paint out now, and now I can clean up that edge a little easier by painting the opposite directions rather than painting in. I can paint out as well. There we go. So you can see very quickly I can create a pretty clean mask where I'm only applying the detail where I want it. We'll turn that mask preview off here so we can see the results. Now here's what I was talking about before. In the past, when you added a basic brush, you could only do one thing with it. But because the adjustment brush has all these other options, I can tune that area with more than just detail. I can control, obviously, the amount of detail. I'm going to turn the detail slider up really high for illustration purposes, but maybe I also want to make it a little bit warmer. So I can grab the color slider and I can warm that area up. And maybe I want to increase the vibrance a little bit too. There we go. So I'm able to affect that whole big area that I've masked with a broad range of adjustments rather than just a single adjustment. And if we look up here at the layer stack, there's the mask that it's created. And I can use that mask over and over again. And I can even use the inverse of that mask. And that's what I want to do. I want to now affect the other side of the image. I want to affect just the blue sky. So we'll add a new layer right here. And I'm going to use the adjustment brush again. And this time, rather than painting, I'm just going to drag and drop the mask from the lower layer up. So I just click on the mask on the lower layer, I drag it, you can see how it's dragging and copying that mask. It pastes it onto the upper layer, and then I'm just going to invert it. What that does is it flips the mask around so that now I'm only affecting the sky. And in here, I can, maybe we want to make the sky a little bit darker. And I want to make the sky a little bit cooler. Not that cool. We don't want it to look green. And maybe we'll add some glow to the sky as well. There we go. That adds kind of a cool, rich, deep blue, glowy sky. Let's take a look at the before and the after. There's before, and there's after. Now, there were a couple questions about the masking bug. I'm going to show you guys how to do the masking bug here on the next image because it doesn't really fit well with this image. So before I leave this image, are there any questions?
Yes, just in case, I know you probably already mentioned it already, but what is the difference between master opacity and layer opacity? There's still a couple people asking those questions.
Yes, this is actually a perfect image to explain the difference here. All right, so in the filter stack, each of these filter slots, there's a filter layer. The layer opacity lets you control the opacity of that individual layer. So for example, if I take the layer opacity slider and I adjust it right now, it's only going to affect this upper layer, which was just the blue sky that we were isolating and working on. So as I adjust this, you'll see how the opacity of that effect, remember the effect that we created was we darkened and we made the sky a little bit more blue and we give it a little bit of a glow. We can now control the overall strength of that effect by using that layer opacity slider. The same thing would happen if I went down a layer and I'm on the layer that's now affecting the building. If I adjust the layer opacity, it's just going to affect the opacity or the strength of the filter that we applied to the building. So it gives us independent control for the overall strength of each layer. Now, in most cases, you can do that by coming down and just adjusting the sliders for the layer. But sometimes, like in this case, like I said, this is a great example for it. This lets you adjust everything all at the same time, basically. So I can dial in just what I want. And this is actually a really common thing to do. I'm going to turn both these on. They're both at 100%. And I sit back and I look at it and I say, wow, that's way too strong. I overdid it. My adjustment's too strong. I can now go back and I can tweak each part individually. So we'll go back to the building side. Maybe I'll bring that layer opacity down just a little bit to be a bit more modest in my adjustment. And we'll go up to the sky and I can do the same thing and I can make it a little bit more modest. The master opacity, the one that lives at the top, Think of it like layer opacity, but for everything all at once. So as I adjust the master opacity, it's going to reduce everything back to the original image. So if I bring the master opacity down to nothing here, although it doesn't seem to be behaving at the moment. Again, keep in mind we're working on a preview build, so there may be a little bug in this one. The master opacity would adjust the overall opacity back to the original image. So it would actually look like this as we adjusted it. So there's the original. That's what master opacity would look like at 0. And then when it was turned all the way up, it would look like that. Now for advanced users, you can also control the blending of each effect layer against the results below it. You can do that by rolling open this blending options section. This is kind of an advanced user area. In here, you can control the blending mode that's used to apply the layer. Again, you've got the layer opacity above. You can also limit the effect to a certain color or tonal range. And you can also protect a certain area. So let's say in this example, I don't want the effect being applied to the highlights. I can just bring this highlight protection slider up and it will reduce the effect on the highlights. So this will protect the clouds from some of that darkening and blurring look like that. Or if it was a portrait and I don't want the effect applied to skin, I can use the skin slider to reduce its effect on skin as well. All right, hopefully that answered a few of those questions. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next image. So the next one, we kind of wanted to look at using the masking bug a bit. So let's use this image. I can show you how the masking bug works. This is a raw file as well, so I want to make sure to open it and edit a copy. There we go. Oh, looks like I got a couple dust bunnies in there, so we'll use the perfect eraser to clean those up. I must have the dustiest sensor known to man. All right, now we'll send it to effects. And I wanted to show you a cool filter that you guys probably haven't seen yet called HDR Look. Now, for most of us, this shot would probably be one that we wouldn't be able to use on its own. It's just too dark. But you'd be amazed the amount of detail that raw files can contain in the shadows. And that's one of the reasons we created the HDR Look Filter. It allows you to take one exposure that's exposed more for the highlights, or that's exposed basically underexposed in the general sense, and then be able to lighten those areas up. So I'm going to come over here. I'll select the HDR Look option. And this does a great job of bringing up detail in the shadows using this compression slider right here. So watch as I crank this compression slider up. It recovers a ton of detail out of those shadows. I can help it out even more by bringing up that shadow slider. There we go. And the idea of this tool is it helps you recreate the look of HDR, of stacking multiple images or multiple exposures together without the need to do it. It lets you create that HDR look with a single tool. So that compression slider is one that I'm going to turn really high. Maybe we'll bring the highlights down just a little bit. This will help recover a little bit of the highlight detail in it. And we'll bring up some of the overall details in the rock and some clarity while we're at it here too. There we go. Let's take a look at the before and after here. There's before and there's after. Brought up a ton of that deep dark information. Now I want to go ahead and I want to affect the sky. I want to make the sky look like it was a long time exposure. This is a great place to use that masking bug. I'm going to go ahead and add a new empty layer. Let's go to the blur category over here, and I'm just going to add a radial blur. When you add the radial blur, you can control the amount of blur. So by bringing that down, you can see how it just controls the overall amount. This is really an opacity of the blur. The quality, of course, I want to have up the top, and then smoothing is kind of unique to the suite. It lets you smooth out that motion blur to make it look more realistic. It adds a little bit of regular blur to it. So I'm just going to bring up that smoothing until I create a nice, soft look in the sky. We can also use the centering tool to pick where the center of that radial blur emanates from. And I want it to emanate right up here at the top at the horizon. So I'm going to move the center up right there to the middle. And now I don't want the motion blur applied to my foreground. I only want it applied to the clouds. This is where the masking bug comes in. I'll select the masking bug tool. The masking bug is a flexible gradient mask tool. What that means is it allows me to blend this blur layer against the layer underneath it, the HDR look, in a flexible, adjustable way. The easiest way to use it is from the preset pop-up right up here. When I click on presets, it contains presets for the most common shapes and use of the bug. I'm going to pick the linear bottom option. What that's going to do is it's going to hide the bottom. There we go. When I do that, it's added a masking bug. It's selected the right type or the right shape right here. And then all I do is I click in the middle. I move it up to my horizon line, right like so. And then I use the feather lines, that's the dashed lines, and I just bring those in really close in this case. That controls how quickly it transitions from one layer to the next. I want to have a very fast transition with my sky, so I'm going to use a very narrow feather in this case. Just like that. Move them out of the scene. So that way that let us blur the sky, make it look like we had motion in the clouds, like it was a much longer exposure at the top. Does that answer questions on the masking bug list?
Yeah, that was perfect.
Okay, cool. I think I have time for one more image, but before I leave this one, I'll just see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, there was a really good question. If you could mention the difference between clarity and detail, because I know they're both in
Okay.
that tone
That
enhancer
is,
pane
well,
and
yep.
kind of
Let's
the
go
difference.
down a step here and we'll talk about the difference between them. So think of detail like small. It's going to bring out the tiniest little details in the image. I'm going to turn it up really high, higher than you'd actually want to use it. And I'll zoom in here on some of the rocks in the foreground. It'll take a second for it to update and render. The HDR look is a big filter. So you can see how this brings out all the tiny little details in the rocks. That's what detail does. Think of it like a local contrast or a micro contrast. Clarity is more like the large adjustment. If I go back to fit to screen, if you're used to the clarity control in Lightroom, I'm going to bring my detail all the way back down here. I'll bring clarity down and I'll show you what clarity does. Clarity is going to affect the bigger, larger areas instead. So if I crank this clarity up really high, you can see how it's increasing contrast, but only in the largest edges, like these isolated clouds, the dark edges of the clouds, the dark edges of the rock against the water. Like that. So usually you use kind of a mix of the two so that I can enhance the small details and the large details by mixing those together. Just a little darker than I like. There we go. All right, I'm going to cancel this and we'll go back and we'll take a look at one more shot. Let's do a portrait because we haven't really done any people yet. Let's send this to layers. Again, I'm going to edit a copy. I'm going to leave this one in Adobe RGB in this case. Now, you notice I'm changing my color space quite a bit. Most people won't actually be doing that. There's kind of one color space that you tend to work with. Yeah, usually Adobe RGB is a very popular one to use. You probably kind of leave that set all the time. The reason I'm going back and forth depends a little bit on my subject matter. I'm opening some raw images that have a ton of extra color in them, so it's nice to have a big broad color space like ProPhoto RGB versus when I'm working on a really old image like this, the first image we worked on, I left it in sRGB because I happen to know that it was a really old camera with a very narrow color space. There wasn't really any benefit in putting it into a big color space. Let's open this one up. And I'm going to use the perfect eraser to actually the perfect eraser, the perfect brush to actually blend in a new background. We're not going to replace the background. I just want to add a little bit of texture to the existing background. A lot of people, when they tend to think of background replacement, they want to completely remove it. It's actually very effective to just augment what you have, and a lot of times it'll look more realistic too. So I'm going to start here in the Extras tab in Perfect Layers. This is where all the extras content is installed. These include different backgrounds, borders, and textures that you can use on your images. I'm going to start in the backgrounds. I'm going to go to the Studio Backdrops. I'll just click on the Quick View browser, and this lets me preview some of those included backgrounds that you can use behind your subjects. They also work as textures pretty well too. I'm going to grab what I want to use right here, and I double click, and I'm going to select the third option, Add as a Layer. This will insert that background as a new layer to my image. There we go. I select the Transform tool, click the Fill button to fill it to my image. I could also now flip it and rotate it to match my image better if I needed to. In this case, the lighting angle works pretty well where it's at. There we go. I'm going to drag it underneath my subject. And now we're just going to paint away this background, but I'm only going to paint it away at 50% opacity. So grab the masking brush, change the opacity down to about 50%, make sure Perfect Brush is enabled, and now I just start to paint. Now watch, I'm just going to paint right along the edge of her hair. I'm doing this without even using Perfect Mask. And this lets me blend in about half of that new background that we put in there. Oops, doggone it. I like all my mouse at the wrong time there.
Do you want me to start singing the Jeopardy theme now? Do, do, do,
I know.
do, do,
That would be a
do.
great feature we could put into the product. Some
I was going to
background
say
music
I
while
could learn
you're
how to
painting.
sing. That would help. Just sing in the background while you work. It'll be quite nice. It'll be like a Disney movie.
You can whistle while you work.
There we go.
Got to make sure that the center of your tool doesn't go into the area you don't want it to go. And in a difficult area like the hair right here, I just hold down the Command key or the Control key on your keyboard and it will stop sampling the color. It makes it easy to get into those little nooks and crannies. It's not often you get to use nooks and crannies in everyday conversation. There we go. Oops. Sorry. One trick when you're painting at 50% opacity is you need to make sure you get it all done in one step. Because as you start to paint over it again, it will continue to decrease the opacity. We want to keep one consistent 50% opacity over that whole background area. There we go. All right, so now we've painted out that background. I'm going to use the new stamped layer command. This will merge the foreground and the background together as one new layer without merging them together. So I still have the original layers underneath I can always go back to if I want to. And now let's go to Perfect Effects. And we're going to use Perfect Effects to do a little bit of skin retouching. And then we're also going to enhance the eyes and mouth. And while we're here, we might as well show you the new vintage filter as well. Now, a lot of people like to use Perfect Portrait, and I think Portrait is a great tool, but it does take a little bit of time for it to load and set up, and it depends on the amount of retouching you're going to do as to which way is going to be faster. For me, a lot of times I use the new Portrait Enhancing filter here inside of Effects instead. I'm just going to zoom in on our image. There we go. To use the Portrait Enhancer, start with the dropper tool. Click on the subject's skin. That sets a color range for the retouching, and then adjust the blemishes and the smoothing slider and the shine slider to dial in the amount of retouching you want. I'm going to bring that shine slider up. That'll even out the color on her skin. Blemishes attacks medium-sized blemishes. She doesn't have a whole lot. And smoothing just adds a little bit of powder to the skin overall. There we go. Now what I like to do is I like to paint it in just on the skin. And to paint it in, just grab the brush, hit invert. That removes it from the image, and now the brush is loaded up with it. And now as I paint, it'll paint it in just where I paint. And because I'm using that perfect brush option, it's only going to paint it in on the skin color. So you can see as I'm painting here, it's only applying it just to the colors of her skin underneath the brush. So it makes it very quick and easy to do a little skin retouching. There we go. Let me turn that on and off so you can see. There's before, there's after. And now let's use the adjustment brush. I'm going to click the detail option. I just want to enhance the detail in her eyes a little bit. Make my brush a little bit smaller. Paint that in on the eyes just to make the eyes pop a little bit. There we go. Again, before, after just the eyes. And then to finish this, let's add a little bit of a vintage look. Vintage looks are really popular right now, and vintage is typically more of a color change. I'll go down to the Quick View Browser button for the vintage category. There we go. We can take a look at some of those cool vintage looks. And I just pick one that I want to use. The lo-fi one looks pretty cool, but I'm going to go for a very subtle one. I'm just going to go for the, well, let's go with the blue-yellow option here. There we go. And that adds just a little bit of vintage color that's really popular right now. So let's look at the before and after. I'm just going to apply this so we can look at it back in perfect layers with the original background for our before and after. There we go. Let me just make one little adjustment here so it's easy for us to see the difference. All right, there's the original, that's our before. And there's after, just like that. All right, any last minute questions out there?
Yeah, we had a question about if you don't want to use the extras from our categories, can you use your own backgrounds and textures and whatnot? Maybe you could
Sure,
touch
you
on
bet.
that.
So any file that you can find, you can add as a layer. I don't know if I have a good example in this case, but let's go back to the browser here. And let's say I wanted to let's go see if there's something we can grab. Sorry, someone is running a leaf blower outside my office. Hopefully that's noise isn't coming in too loud there. Let's go say I was out shooting one day and I found a cool texture that I like, and I just have it with the rest of my pictures. All you do is you select the picture that you want, and then I'm just going to send it to layers. And when I do that, just select that add as a layer option, and that will insert it as a layer into my image. You can then use the transform tool to rotate it and fill the image. And then by changing the blending mode and the opacity, you can use it as a texture. The trick to use an image as a texture is to use typically either overlay or soft light are kind of my two favorite blending modes to use for a texture. The other two that can be useful are multiply if it's a very light texture and you want to make the image dark, or screen if it's a really dark texture and you want to make it look light. But it's usually that overlay and soft light, sometimes even hard light. Those are kind of the most common ones to use. I always start with soft light, and then the layer opacity controls how strong that texture is going to be. Now, in the very near future, just after we ship Perfect Photo Suite 8, there'll be a free maintenance update, and it will actually include a new tool called the Extras Manager, where you'll be able to import your own textures, backgrounds, and borders, and be able to use them inside of filters like Perfect Effects. So that's coming very soon. As you guys know, we're constantly improving and updating the products, and that'll be a free update coming out probably before the end of the year. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, the last question right before we leave is just in case you made a mistake on creating a mask inside Perfect Layers, how can you swap between masking in and out?
Sure, that's a good question here. Let's just go back to an image. Let's go back to the original one we were working on here. And I'm going to grab the masking brush. And while I'm painting, I'm just going to do this in a very simple way. Let's go ahead and I'm going to do a split screen. And I'm going to turn the left one into a grayscale mask view. This is more just for educational, so you guys can see how this works. When you're painting with a mask, the mode will normally be set to paint out. And what that's really doing is it's painting with black paint. You can see as I run my brush along the edge of her sleeve, it's automatically detecting that edge, and it's painting with black. But let's say I made a mistake and I let my brush wander into her shirt. Well, obviously, we don't want it to wander into the shirt. We've got a couple different options. The first thing you can do, and a lot of times it's the easiest, is just to undo. Just use the undo command. That's Control Z or Command Z on your keyboard. But if that's not the practical way to do it, you can always just change your paint mode. And there's a couple ways to do that. You can go up here to the mode pop-up, change it from paint out to paint in. You could also use the X key on your keyboard. That will toggle from paint in to paint out. Or if you just want to do it temporarily, you can hold down the Option key or the Alt key and it'll change it just temporarily. So once you get good at it and you're using it all the time, holding that Option or Alt key just to toggle and reverse the mode temporarily is the easiest way to do it. So in this case, I was like, oh no, I started to paint her shirt out. I would just hold down the Option key instead and start to paint it back in. You can see how it paints in instead of paints out, just like that. And that works whether you're using the perfect brush option or not. Those are just general purpose tools. All right. Hopefully that answered that question. Anything else?
Uh, the last question before we leave is definitely whether you can batch process. I'm not sure you touched on that.
I didn't touch on batch, and there's actually a really powerful new batch processing tool in Perfect Photo Suite 8. You can access it by you can do it here inside of layers by going to File and Batch, but the more common way to do it is actually going to be from the browser, or if you're inside of Lightroom or Aperture, you'll select the images that you want to batch process in those locations. So let's find something a little bit more realistic here. Let's say, let's say I want to batch process these 4 images. I can just select a group of images, either in the browser or in Lightroom or Aperture, and select batch. In this case, I can just right-click and select batch. If I'm inside of Lightroom or Aperture, I will go to the File, Plugin Extras menu and select Perfect Batch. When I do that, the batch dialog appears, and from here, you can control a ton of different options. Now, every batch has to have a source and a destination. It's what you're starting with and what you want them to end up as. And in the middle, you can insert as many modules as you want. And those modules are the same modules you see up here in the upper right-hand corner. Your source can either be the selected items, that's kind of the most common way to do it, but you could also just pick a folder of images. So let's say I am a portrait photographer and I went out and I shot 1,000 pictures at a wedding, and I need to make them small little JPEGs with my watermark in the corner that I'm going to put into my sales software, for example. So I could select all of those images either using one of these 2 options. Let's say I want to scale them down, so I'm going to use Perfect Resize to change their size, and I only need 1,000 pixels for my sales software. And I'm going to use 72 pixels per inch. I'm just making small little screen-sized images for my sales software, or if I was sending them to the client for proofing or for a website. And I want to put my logo in the corner. I want to add a watermark to these. So I can click on that module. I can add a watermark. And with the watermark, you can pick the file that you want to use. In this case, I'm using the little On1 logo. It remembers your most commonly used logo files. You can pick its size and its position and its location within the image. So I'm just going to make it really big so you can see it. There's the logo, but I want it down in the bottom right-hand corner, and I don't want it to be very big. So I'm just going to pick about 10% of the image size. The location picks where in the image it goes. I'm going to pick the bottom right-hand corner. Inset lets you control how close it is to the border. I'm going to leave it in the image just a little bit so it's hard to crop out. And then opacity controls how opaque it is, as you'd expect. And then below that, the last one is destination. This controls where stuff goes. So I want to put these into a new folder. Let's put them on my desktop. And I can put them into a subfolder. Let's just call it batch output. And I'm going to save these as JPEG files. You can save them as any of the supported file types. I only need about 90% quality or 80% quality for these. My sales software works best in sRGB, and I'll just leave them named the way they are. That way I can correlate these little ones back to the big ones. But if I wanted to, I could batch rename these to any combination of naming that I want. Now when I hit OK, it'll take those images I selected. It's going to make them 1,000 pixels. It's going to add my little logo in the corner, and it's going to make them sRGB JPEGs. So they'll be ready for my sales software. That's just one example of what you could do with this. And you can save anything you create in that batch dialog as a preset, so you can use them over and over very quickly. I've got one that I use that actually makes little JPEGs and just puts them on my desktop. So if I need to email them, it's easy to email something. As one example. So there we go. There's that batch output folder that I put on my desktop. There's my little images right there, and my logo down there in the corner, just like that. So a really powerful, handy little batch processing tool, and it's the only one that I know that lets you string multiple modules together. So you could use, oh, let's say I wanted to use Perfect Portrait to do retouching and then add my border and look with perfect effects and then add a watermark to them, or you name it. You can do all sorts of cool things with that batch processing engine. All right, let's just wrap up here. So we really only touched today on a little bit of the browse module, and we talked a little bit about the batch processor. We did use the new Perfect Eraser quite a bit. That's a super powerful tool for removing all those little annoying objects and distractions in your images. You notice I used it on almost every image I opened up. There's something that I wanted to get rid of. And then we spent most of our time today in Perfect Effects. We looked at the new HDR Look, Portrait Enhancer, and Vintage filter, plus the new Antique filter. We showed you how to use the new masking bug as well. So you got a good look at some of the newest features in Perfect Photo Suite 8. I would definitely check out some of the other webinars and learn more about the new Enhance module. And hopefully that answers everybody's questions today. Here at On Software, we are committed to photographers, so everything we do is by photographers and for photographers. We don't build things for search engines or video editors or anybody else. So your feedback is really important to us. So we have a website called labs.onsoftware.com where we talk about what we're building for the future. We want your feedback so that we can make sure we're building the right stuff. That's also the same reason when we do the public beta. We want you guys to use our software and give us feedback so we can do the right things in the future. We're very open about what we're working on. We provide free training and webinars, just like the one you're looking at today, free monthly customer loyalty rewards, kind of like that update that I just mentioned, as well as cool textures, backgrounds, and presets. Free US and UK-based technical support. You can call them up on the phone. They're product experts. They speak English. They're happy to help you out. And of course, we have our 30-day money-back guarantee on a product that you actually own. There's no recurring monthly fees for our software. It's available on November 26th, but again, you can get the pre-release or the beta version right now and start playing with it. If you already have Perfect Photo Suite 7, the two work side by side, and it'll automatically upgrade all of your presets. So any presets you created in Suite 7 or Suite 6 will work inside of Suite 8 and are safe to continue to work. They're on sale right now as part of the launch introduction. The Suite 8 Premium Edition works anywhere you want. It'll work in Lightroom, Aperture, or Photoshop, or as a standalone. It's only $300. It's only $180. Or if you're not using Photoshop anymore, you can get the Lightroom and Aperture Edition for only $129. And of course, there's good discounts if you're a current customer as well. All right, Liz, any last minute questions?
No last minute questions, but just a heads up for you guys. I know there's a lot of questions in there. If I didn't get to any of your questions, I was trying to do them as fast as I could. Don't forget that we have awesome customer service. Dan mentioned it just a second ago, but any questions that I wasn't able to get to today, just send them to our customer service guys and they'll be able to help you out. They're really great and they're really, really nice. So just a heads up so that you guys can get all those questions answered.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. Again, this webinar is recorded, so you can always watch it again later. Check out the archive webinar section of our website or our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.